My name is Daniel and I'm 34 years old. When I was 9 years old, I stood in our kitchen in Ohio holding a report card with straight A's, and my father looked at it for 2 seconds before he set it down on the counter, next to the mail he hadn't opened yet, and said, "Your brother didn't even need to try that hard." He never said I did badly. He just never said I did well. That silence sat in the room longer than any shouting ever could have. I remember the exact hum of the refrigerator behind me while I waited for him to say something else. He didn't. That was the moment I learned that being good at something wasn't the same as being seen for it. For 19 years, I tried to prove I was enough. I picked a career in structural engineering because it was hard, because it meant something written down, stamped, undeniable. I worked weekends when other people my age were at bars or ball games. I stayed quiet when coworkers took credit for calculations I'd stayed up until 2 a.m. to finish, because at least there was no father in the room comparing me to a brother who didn't even need to try. I built a life out of proof. Diplomas. Certifications. A signed inspection report with my name at the bottom. I thought if I collected enough of them, the silence from that kitchen would finally stop echoing. It didn't. Not until Elena. Elena was 31, a third-grade teacher, and the first person who ever asked me what I wanted instead of what I'd already achieved. On our third date, at a small Italian place with red paper tablecloths, I noticed I flinched when the waiter set her plate down first and mine 10 minutes later, cold air from the kitchen door drifting over us every time it opened. She didn't make a big thing of it. She just quietly slid her plate toward me and pulled the empty space in front of her, and said, "There. Now it's fair." It was such a small moment. But I remember the exact scrape of the plate against the tablecloth, because it was the first time in my life someone had made things fair without being asked, without me earning it first. We got married 2 years later, in a backyard with string lights and a borrowed sound system that kept cutting out during the vows, which somehow made everyone laugh instead of panic. Elena had one sister, Grace, 28, sharp-tongued and funny, the kind of person who says the true thing at the dinner table when everyone else is chewing quietly instead of speaking. And Elena had a mother, Carol, 59, who ran the family the way some people run a small business, with quiet audits on who owed her what, and warm smiles that never quite reached the math behind her eyes. I remember standing at the altar that day, watching Elena walk toward me in a simple dress with no train, no fuss, and thinking that for the first time in 26 years, nobody in that yard was comparing me to anyone. Grace gave a toast that night that made 3 people spill their drinks laughing, something about how Elena used to make me practice small talk in the mirror before family dinners. Carol gave a shorter toast, polished, careful, the kind you write in advance and revise twice. I didn't think much of it then. I think about it differently now. For the first 3 years of our marriage, Carol was polite to me. Distant, but polite. She complimented my work ethic the way you'd compliment a stranger's dog, safely, from a distance. Then Elena and I bought a house. It wasn't a big house. 3 bedrooms, a yellow porch light that buzzed faintly at night, a driveway that cracked a little more every winter. We'd saved for 6 years for the down payment, my overtime pay, Elena's summer tutoring money, a small inheritance from my grandmother that still smelled faintly of her cedar closet when I opened the envelope. Carol had contributed $8,000 toward the closing costs. A gift, she'd said at the time, squeezing Elena's hand across the table. Just a gift. I remember the exact wording of the text message she sent that week. "Consider it our wedding present to the house." 14 days before our 5th wedding anniversary, Carol called a family dinner. I remember the date because Elena had circled it on the kitchen calendar in red pen, October 3rd, right next to a grocery list that still said milk, eggs, candles. At that dinner, the table set with Carol's good china, the kind only brought out twice a year, Carol set down her fork and said, in front of everyone, "I think it's time we talk about the house." That money wasn't a gift. It was an investment. I want my name on the deed. The room went quiet. Elena's fork stopped halfway to her mouth. Her father's chewing slowed. Somewhere in the kitchen, the oven timer beeped once and nobody moved to silence it. I asked, calmly. Carol, we have the text message where you called it a gift. Carol didn't blink. She folded her napkin once, precisely, the way she did everything. People say things. Family helps family. I'm not asking for much, just what's fair. That word again. Fair. Except this time it didn't feel like Elena sliding her plate toward mine. It felt like a door quietly closing somewhere down a hallway I couldn't see. Grace, sitting across the table, put her napkin down harder than she needed to and said, Mom, you can't just decide 5 years later that a gift was a loan. That's not fair, that's control. Carol's face went tight, the corners of her mouth pulling in like she'd tasted something sour. She said Grace didn't understand what it meant to build something for 30 years and watch it slip away, to lie awake worrying about her own retirement while everyone else got their fresh start handed to them. It was the closest she ever came to admitting she was scared, not cruel. She wasn't trying to hurt me. She was trying to hold on to something she felt slipping through her fingers as she got older, and even in that moment, I understood it, even as it hurt us both. But Elena didn't back Grace up. Not that night. She looked at her mother, then at her sister, and said quietly, almost pleading, Grace, please don't make this into a fight. Grace stood up so fast her chair scraped against the hardwood. I'm not the one making it a fight, Elena. I'm the one telling the truth at it. She grabbed her coat off the back of the chair and left before dessert, the front door clicking shut behind her instead of slamming, which somehow felt worse. That night, in the car, Elena was shaking. Not crying, shaking, the way you do when you're holding something in with both hands and your knuckles go white on the steering wheel. She said Grace had embarrassed the family in front of her father, in front of the neighbors who'd probably heard through the thin dining room windows. I said Grace had defended us, defended the truth. Elena didn't answer. She stared straight ahead at the traffic light until it turned green. 2 days later, I noticed Grace's name had disappeared from the top of Elena's messages. She'd blocked her sister's number. For the next 11 days, our house felt like it was holding its breath. Elena wouldn't talk about the deed, wouldn't talk about her mother, wouldn't talk about Grace. She'd set 2 coffee mugs out every morning out of habit, an old ritual from when Grace used to stay over on weekends, and then just stare at the second one for a second too long before quietly putting it back in the cabinet. I watched her do this 4 mornings in a row before I said anything, and even then, all she said was, I don't want to talk about it yet. What Elena didn't know, what I hadn't told her yet, was that 8 months earlier, I had already transferred my portion of the house into a trust in both our names, protecting it from exactly this kind of claim. Not because I suspected Carol at the time. Because my own father, back when I was 26, had once told a lender I owed him money I never owed, just to control a decision I'd made without asking his permission first. I had learned, the hard way, sitting in a bank office arguing over a debt that didn't exist, to put things in writing before anyone else could rewrite them later. So I had the trust documents, notarized, filed. I had the original bank transfer record showing Carol's $8,000 landing in our account. With the memo line typed in her own handwriting on the wire form, wedding gift, house fund. I had never shown any of it to Elena. I didn't want our marriage to run on proof. I wanted it to run on trust. But now trust wasn't enough on its own, and quietly, I knew I would need the proof after all. On the 11th day, my phone rang. It was Grace, calling from a number I didn't recognize, her voice tight and fast like she'd been rehearsing the words in her car before dialing. Daniel, she said, I need to tell you something, and I need you to not hate me for knowing it before you did. She told me that 2 years earlier, at Thanksgiving, she'd stepped out onto the back porch for air and overheard Carol on the phone with a lawyer, asking what it would take to add her name to a property informally gifted to family. The lawyer had told her that without documentation, a verbal gift claim rarely held up in any real dispute, but that family pressure alone sometimes worked better than paperwork ever could. Carol had laughed, quietly, and said, that's what I'm counting on. Grace had carried that phone call for 2 years, hoping it would never matter, hoping her mother would let it go. When the October dinner happened, she finally said something out loud, and it cost her a sister. I told Grace what I had. The trust. The bank memo. All of it, laid out in one long breath. Grace went quiet on the line for a moment, then said, "Elena needs to see this from you. Not from me. She needs to hear it and still choose you, on her own." 2 weeks later, Carol called another family dinner, this time to finalize the deed conversation once and for all. I asked Elena, quietly, in the kitchen beforehand, if I could speak first at the table. I hadn't said much since October, and she looked surprised, her eyes searching mine for a second before she nodded. I laid the documents on the table, calm, no raised voice, the good china clinking softly as I set the folder down beside it. I said, "Carol, I want to say something, and I want to say it once. This house is not a mistake, and it is not up for negotiation. It has been legally protected, in both our names, for 8 months. Your gift was generous, and we are grateful for it, the memo line even says so, in your own words. But it was a gift. Not a stake." Carol opened her mouth, then closed it. For the first time since I'd known her, Carol had nothing to say at all. Elena's father shifted in his chair and looked down at his plate, suddenly very interested in his food. Elena's aunt, visiting for the weekend, quietly reached over and refilled her own water glass, the way people do when they need somewhere to put their hands during a silence that heavy. Elena looked at the papers. Then she looked at her mother. Then she said the sentence I will remember for the rest of my life, "Mom, I love you. But I need you to hear Grace's name in this room, because she was right, and she paid for being right, alone, for 2 years." Carol didn't apologize that night. Her jaw stayed tight through dessert, and she left 20 minutes early, claiming a headache. But 3 days later, she sent Elena a card, no explanation attached, just, "I was scared of being forgotten. I handled it badly. I'm sorry. It wasn't everything. But it was something, and I chose to accept it as a start rather than demand more than she had left to give." Elena unblocked Grace's number that same afternoon. I know because I heard the notification chime from the kitchen, and Elena laughed, a small, wet, relieved laugh, before she'd even finished reading the text. We didn't take Carol's name off future holidays. We didn't ask her to leave family dinners, and we didn't need to punish her to feel like we'd won something. Elena set one boundary instead, gently but clearly: the house was never to be discussed at the table again, and if it ever came up, the conversation would end and everyone would quietly go home. Carol agreed, her voice smaller than I'd ever heard it. She has kept that agreement for the 8 months since, without a single slip. A few weeks after that dinner, Grace came over on a Sunday morning still wearing her running shoes, out of breath from the walk over. The 3 of us sat on the cracked driveway in folding chairs, drinking coffee out of the same 2 mugs Elena used to set out of habit, plus a 3rd mug pulled down from the back of the cabinet for Grace. Nobody mentioned the deed. Nobody mentioned Carol. Elena just leaned her head on her sister's shoulder for a second, the porch light still buzzing faintly above us even in daylight, the way you do when 11 days of silence finally exhale. I think about my father sometimes, and the report card he never praised. I think about Carol, who was so afraid of being left behind that she almost left behind the daughter who told her the truth. I've learned that the people who raised us don't always hand us love the way we need it. Sometimes they hand us fear, dressed up as fairness, and expect us to carry it without noticing the difference. Breaking that cycle doesn't mean cutting everyone off. It means learning to tell the difference between a person who is scared and a person who is cruel, and responding honestly to whichever one is actually sitting across the table from you. If you've ever sat in a room where the truth cost someone their seat at the table, I hope you remember Grace. I hope you remember that telling the truth, even when it's unwelcome, even when it costs you something for a while, is still worth it, because someone, eventually, will thank you for it, even if it takes 2 years and 1 quiet phone call to get there. If this story meant something to you, consider subscribing. Every story here is for someone who needed to hear it, at exactly the moment they needed to hear it most.